The Doss Harrington McCool family here. Glad to have you with us. And so we are in Revelation chapter 13. So as you have been studying with us, you know now that I'm going to give you a lot of information. Probably not going to get past chapter 13 because just like last week, there was so much information to pack into. It wound up taking about almost a full hour. I hope it doesn't take a full hour tonight. But we're going to look at just chapter 13 of this section of Revelation. Chapter 12 through 14 is Revelation for real. One more chance to check these. It looks like everything is working on the YouTube and all. Getting some positive feedback on everything, so we're good to go. So I want to real quick remind you of where we are. We are studying Revelation chapters 12 through 13, and this is part of an overall outline that is available on our sermon notes. Let me see if I can get that and post that real fast onto the Facebook page for you. Here we go. I'm going to post it right here. There's the link. I just popped it up. If you go there, it should be a sermon notes archive list, and if you go there, it should pop up. Let me double check. If it is doing that right now, go to this week's note. Yes, is Revelation for real. Just so you understand, this outline is, for example, you'll see number 1, the first section, the 7 candlesticks. Then you have the 7 seals, number 2. And then you have number 3, the 7 trumpets. And now we're into number 4, the 7 symbolic figures. What's going to happen is every week this outline is going to grow. It's going to be the exact same spot on here. It's just going to grow. You'll look down below, you'll see number 5, 6, and 7. There's nothing under those yet because we haven't gotten that far. So each week I will keep adding to this and it will grow. If you look there at the top where it says Revelation is for real, you'll see where it says view all past notes. So if you go here and for some reason it's not the first one to pop up, just click that button, view all past notes, and scroll down and you'll find this outline is Revelation for real. I hope that helps. I had a lot of questions on that. I'm glad that this has been helpful for you. And so we're going to continue that study. So we, last week, studied Revelation chapter 12. And in Revelation chapter 12, we went through there and we saw 3 of these 7 symbolic figures, as I call it. And we saw the first was a woman that was presented. And then there was a child that was presented, and then also a dragon. Those are the 3 things that we saw, and just to kind of remind you of what was going on there, this is funny. It wasn't supposed to do all that I had right there, but I'll explain it. So you have in chapter 12 these 3 parts of the scenes. The dragon tries to kill the child. That's the first thing you see. Then the dragon pursues the woman, and then the dragon pursues her descendants. And so that looks like, as going for what the dragon is trying to do, is trying to find a victory. But as you can see, I've got crossed out there. It is not victory for the dragon. In fact, no one can frustrate the purposes of God. And that's the message that the vision that John received is trying to transmit, is that no one's going to frustrate the purposes of God. Remember that child was caught up? We recognize that the woman represents physical and spiritual Israel. In other words, Israel of the physical time in the past, and now spiritual Israel, the church today. We recognize that the child was Christ, who was born from physical Israel, but now is our master, our Lord in the spiritual Israel. And then the descendants are a continuation of the church. And of course, the Bible tells us very clearly in chapter 12 that the dragon is Satan. Don't forget, all of this is symbolism. So keeping that in mind, as we go into chapter 14, we're going to see some interesting things. So here's the overall, once again, of looking at chapters 12 through 14. There's really 3 different sections, and what you see there, that first section of the woman, child, and the dragon, that's chapter 12, all right, and that's the Great War, if you will, if you want to add titles to this. Now we're going to get into chapter 13 here, and we're going to see that this is Satan's allies. I want you to see that as you're putting this together, and then next week we'll get into chapter 14, and we'll talk about the Lamb and the harvest, and there's more to that chapter. So let's go ahead and let's read chapter 13, and let's look and see what we find here and what we see. All right, so get your Bibles and read with me Revelation chapter 13. Now, I'm using the New King James Version, and many of you might be seasoned Bible studiers, and so you can read in your version and follow along. But if you're new to this study, sometimes versions have different ways of saying things, just different verbiage, and so what you might hear me read might be slightly different than what's in your Bible, but it's the same. It comes from the same source. And the good thing about it is sometimes you should read other versions to hear how it's said. So let's take a look at what is written in Revelation chapter 13. Pay attention to all of the elements, and then we'll explain what those mean. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon, who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth, speaking great things with blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of the men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except for one who has the mark of the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, as we look at this chapter, it's at this point that a lot of the different interpretations go all over the board. You know, as you've seen over and over and over, this has gotten more complicated or more dramatic imagery, lots of other things that are happening. And so whenever you wind up with books like this one, The 4 Views of Revelation by Steve Gregg, which is a fascinating read, but you can see side by side here, right beside each other, are the 4 different views. And when you get into these chapters 12 and then especially 13, which ends up with the mark of the beast, wow, you wind up with some really wild and outlandish claims and theories and interpretations. So what's a person supposed to do? I mean, this is pretty scary stuff whenever you stop and you read it. You got these beasts coming up out of the ground. You've got the number of the beast and all these 7 heads. I mean, these are hideous, horrible looking figures. Well, remember what I said at the beginning and what it says there at the top of the screen. These are 7 symbolic figures. It's symbolism. Just like Jesus is called a lamb. Never forget that. Jesus is called a lamb, and so therefore, if he is a lamb, well, you can have other imagery that's scary to help you remember things. So let's take a look at what we've got going on here. And first and foremost, as I told you before, this is Satan's allies. This is nothing more than Satan summing up his allies. We saw in the previous chapter how they had started this war. There was this war in heaven. And so now Satan is summoning up those who might help him. Now that does not mean that Satan created these beasts. He did not create anything. He doesn't have the capability of creating anything. Instead, that's why I use the word summon, because they already existed. All Satan does is use his influence and use his ability to reach into the darkness that already existed in the hearts of men and cause that evil to come up and out. And that's what these beasts represent. These beasts represent basically what man does for the devil, for Satan, for the dragon. Now let's take a look and remind you, don't read too much into these. These are symbols. And so basically I'm going to go ahead and tell you what they are right up front, and then we'll start breaking it down so you can see the individual parts. First and foremost, these 2 beasts represent anti-God entities. Remember that, anti-God entities. You know, a lot of people like to use the word antichrist. Unfortunately, they've taken the word antichrist and they have turned that word into an individual, trying to find a particular person. Well, listen, anything or anybody can be an antichrist. And so I like the term anti-God or against God. So if you're anti-God, in this case, one beast represents anti-God governments, and the other beast represents anti-God religion. And so this is what we need to understand as we're reading these and learning these. Now, the fact that this beast comes up out of the sea is one of our first clues. One of the first things that we see coming up out of the sea is this is a literary device that is used quite often, and that the sea typically represents a world and nations, peoples. And so this is a very common device that's used, and so that's where the beast rises up out of the nations, out of the people, out of the world. And then you look at the description that he has. So this beast, he stood on the sand and on the sea, and I saw the beast rising up out of the sea, and he had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now we talked about last week that the dragon had multiple heads. You still see that there in the picture. And we talked about heads typically represent that authority, represent the mental state, it represents power. And so that's what this is when you think about authority and power and government and things like that. Now what winds up happening is a lot of people want to start reading a lot into this. And let me just pull these up real quick. So here now, to update the figures that we have a woman, a child, a dragon, we have the beast of the sea, and the beast of the earth. Now I want to go ahead and give you the third one in this chapter, which would be number 6 overall, and I'll explain it when we get down there to it, and that is those marked by the beast. So here we have 6 of those 7 symbolic figures now in this 13th chapter. And so this first one, and you know, we've talked about, I've showed you in the past the pictures that we've had, how people have all these different pictures that they like to paint to show what these might look like. And here's the one that was telling you about that we purchased from Mrs. Smith, where she's taken now, you can see the dragon there, and you can see these 2 beasts. And notice the one beast that comes up out of the water, and there's those 7 heads and the 10 horns and the crowns. And then you have the other beast over there, back, let me go the other way here, right there. That beast is the one that comes up out of the earth, all right? And then at the top, right there, I can't get my fingers right here. Straight up there, you see those that are marked with the beast, the number of the beast. All right, so there's your picture of the dragon who's given them the authority and all that. So this incredible figure. Now, these 7 heads. All right, a lot of people want to start speculating, and that's okay. I mean, you can let your imagination, I should say, run wild with the imagery, because that's part of the reason for the descriptions that we have, is to help you remember, to get you to think and stuff like that. And so a lot of commentaries want to start assigning names to this, saying, oh, well, this is Rome. You know, that Rome had the 7 hills. Let me run over here real quick. If you look at the city of Rome, and if you look at a map, there are these 7 hills, the most famous one being the Palatine Hill, where their emperors lived. But it was built upon these 7 hills, and so a lot of people immediately see that as a connection, especially whenever you look at chapter 17, verse 9, which talks about that. It says, this is wisdom, it's the 7 hills. That's, by the way, talking about Babylon. But so do the 7 hills represent those 7 heads and so forth? You know, that's an interesting thought. But here's something I was thinking about. The fact is that we have the number 7. We see that all the time. And the number 7 means complete. The number 7 means whole. And so you remember that there were 7 churches in the churches of Asia. Now, that's not all the churches that there are in the world at that time. There's many more, but why did they pick those 7 churches? Well, because those 7 churches, if 7 means complete and total, then that's a picture of the whole church. Every congregation that ever is or was or will be can fit into one of those 7 categories. In other words, that's a representation of the church, what all churches go through. Well, why couldn't the 7 heads be the same thing? This is a representation of all nations, of all things that are any nation that is anti-God. See, any nation, even today, that is anti-God is just as much a part of the beast as Rome was back then. You think about the people who are reading this letter. Immediately their mind's going to go to Rome. They're going to be thinking of that. Other people have taken this and said, well, this is the 7 greatest world empires up to that time, and they'll lump in there Egypt, and they'll go to Babylon, the Assyrian, Babylon, Medo-Persians, the Greeks, and then Rome, and I'm missing one there, but they'll name those 7 as being the greatest empires, and that's what that means. But remember, this is symbolism. And so if this is anti-God government, then this represents any government that has ever existed. All right, so notice that also that there are other descriptions here. This description about how the beast was like a leopard. His feet were like that of a bear. His mouth like that mouth of a dragon. The dragon gave him power. Now, I keep saying that this is symbolism, and you might sometime ask, well, how do you know that, Troy? Well, you remember at the beginning of this study, I said you need to know the entire Bible if you really want to understand Revelation. Well, that's because when you read verses like verse 2, immediately Daniel 7 comes to mind. And so Daniel 7, if I go there and read that passage, let's see here, Daniel 7, beginning in verse 3. It says, and four great beasts came up from the sea. Isn't that interesting? The same type of verbiage that John is using, each different from the other. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off and was lifted from the earth to stand on feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it. Suddenly another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side, had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, arise, devour much flesh. After I looked, there was another like a leopard, and it had 4. And see what's happening there? Don't forget, the people of the first century, they're going to know and understand the scriptures, the Old Testament, and they immediately would have recognized that this belonged to the prophet Daniel. See, this is a part of prophecy. Revelation is prophecy, but it's also apocalyptic literature. He's giving you this imagery, calling up this old prophetic imagery to help you get this picture in your mind. Now, of course, you think about symbolism and you can think about what all those things mean. Thing is, all four of those, or all these animals, are predators that devour. That's the symbolism that goes with this. Now, I told you, people have all kinds of incredible interpretations and things like that. This picture I found a while back where somebody was trying to use this to interpret Revelation and try to bring in Daniel in the same process. And so they were assigning, the United States, our symbol is the eagle. And you read that in here, this eagle. Apparently Russia is the bear, and Britain is the lion, and so forth. And so they're trying to assign these world powers today. 2,000 years after this letter was written today, they're trying to assign these powers. You're completely missing the point. This is a timeless letter. It's written for all Christians, and as I've said in every single study that we've had, it's to encourage Christians. And so, if this is symbolism, what we're looking at here are the sum of all types of power, of world powers. That's what the crowns mean, and the horns and stuff like that. There's all kinds of commentary in there that you can read that's fascinating and stuff like that, but be careful with it because it's symbolism. And so notice the next part that we have here. It says, I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. And so there's a lot of commentary once again on who that is. And one of the key things a lot of people says is this was Nero. I think that's what I have right here. So Nero in AD 58 committed suicide. And so everybody says, oh, well, there you go. There's a blow to the empire. But then it healed itself because then it came back. And so people look at it as the persecutor, Rome, receives this fatal or mortal wound. Again, this is symbolism, and maybe the first century Christians read that into it or saw something there, but I'm sure as they connected Daniel to this, understanding that we're talking about world powers and symbolism, I'm sure they understood this as well. When I read that about the head being mortally wounded, I'll tell you the first thing that came to mind for me was Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, you remember what God said to the serpent? One thing I love about Bible computers, Bible programs. And I will put enmity between you and the woman. Listen to it. And between your seed and her seed, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. You hear that? He shall bruise your head. You see, when Jesus Christ came to this earth, and whenever he rose from the dead, he bruised Satan's head. Who are we talking about in Revelation here? We're talking about Satan and his allies. And so that's what I read into that. All right. We continue reading, and we see that, so they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast. See, remember what I said about this is Satan's allies? And so here we see that they're working for Satan. He gives them this authority, and they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies. And he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Here's another one of those. This whole chapter is full of so very much symbolism. And so here once again, people see that number and they start trying to calculate all kinds of things. And one of the key things that people try to calculate is, when the end of the world is going to be. If you remember at the beginning of this study, when we first started this study, we talked about nobody knows. Nobody knows. And so if it's impossible to know, then when somebody claims to have predicted, well, that means somebody knows. And so I don't see how that can work if the Bible says no one knows. So if no one knows, then what's the most logical conclusion? If we know for a fact that nobody knows the date. So don't use this number to try to calculate the return of Christ or the end of the world. So what does the number mean? Well, it means the same thing it's been meaning all this time. Go back just a little bit to chapter 12, verse 14, and back up some more to verse 6, and you'll see those same numbers. 3.5 or 42 months here. Go back to chapter 11, verse 11, and chapter 11, verse 2. Once again, you see these numbers. Basically, they're an incomplete number. And what that means is that there is a specific time, but it is not an indefinite time. It is not infinite. It's a limited time. And God is the one who makes that time. See, Satan's not in control of how much time he has on this earth. That's what we talked about last week. Satan's not in control of time. God, and that's one of the things that should encourage Christians. God controls everything. It'll be according to God's timing. So Satan's trying to do everything he can as fast as he can so that 42 months or 3.5, or anytime you see that number that equals up to that 3.5, that represents the Christian dispensation, the time we're in right now. It's incomplete time, as one of the comments there is. That's exactly right. And so don't forget that. In fact, there's another way this is going to be used in a little while when we get on deeper into the book, and that is the 1,000 years. It's equivalent to that too. It has to do with the Christian dispensation. So he has authority to do his thing during this time, the Christian dispensation. So the beast then operates according to the limits that God places on him. And then it says in there that he spoke lots of blasphemies. Look at the next verse, verse 6. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God. Blasphemy is to speak against, to say something against someone or something. In this case, he spoke against God. He blasphemes his name. Don't forget what Jesus said about that. His tabernacle and those who dwell in heaven. He was cursing and talking bad about anything and everything that had to do with God. Now, I told you how, or have mentioned many times, how the book of Revelation appeals to stuff in the Old Testament. Well, here's another one when it says his tabernacle. He blasphemes his tabernacle. Wait a minute, John. In this vision, there is no tabernacle. There's the temple. Herod's temple is over there. And if the time frame is right, that this is happening around 96 AD, the temple no longer exists. But people still know that temple. It was destroyed by the Roman Empire in AD 70, but there was that temple. There was no tabernacle. So what's he talking about? Well, he's appealing back to the days of Exodus, whenever God commanded Moses to make a tent. And in that tent was the holy place, and then the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of Covenant was. And that's where God lived among his people. Well, God lives among his people today in these tabernacles. Paul calls these bodies we have tabernacles. And so he blasphemes God. He blasphemes his name. He blasphemes the church. And he blasphemes even those who've gone on to their reward. This is one bad dude, if you will, this beast. And so I hope you can see now when we talk about that it being the governments, that's what this is. All right, so it says then, he blasphemes these, and he granted him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. The authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And to say something like that, of every tribe, tongue, and nation, basically is showing that there's going to be evil influence. There's going to be sin. There's going to be temptations and persecutions and things like that in every nation, in every ethnicity, in every single society that ever is, will, or was. And so he overcomes them. The saints of this day and age were experiencing that. They were being persecuted and they were being overcome. And so when we consider what is happening in the first century and the people reading this, they're going to understand that. It says, all who dwell on the earth will worship him. Whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. You see, now you're seeing a separation. You're seeing two different kinds of people here. You're seeing a group of people who worship the beast and a group of people who don't worship the beast. You see what I mean when I'm talking about the allies, lining up God's allies? And I'm going to show you that some more in just a moment. So they worship the beast. Now, this is significant because during the Roman Empire, some of these Caesars, like Augustus, he built a temple to the Roman, to deify, or to, what's the word I'm looking for, to show reverence to Julius Caesar, because the Roman Senate had deified him, made him into a god. And so this temple was built. And after that point, there were other Caesars that deified themselves. You see these other names that are here. And if you go on and look at your history, you'll see that a lot of the Caesars got to the point where they, as I put in this other slide that was there, they demanded that people call them Lord. They call him God. They even call him Savior. And so you have this emperor worship. So look at that. When you're reading this, in the first century, people are being told to worship. Let's just make it real here. Let's use America. All right, Rome is not the same as America, so don't misunderstand me. But let's use America. Could you imagine if your leaders, the senators and the presidents and the people that we've had, tell you you need to bow down and worship them? That's what they're dealing with in Rome. And so it says all on the earth who fell down to worship him. Talking about that beast who is led by the dragon and whose names have not been written in the book of life. Now here's a little preview to what's coming up in chapter 20. When you see everybody stand before the throne and that those books were open and you see the book of life. You see that referred to in several other places, like Philippians chapter 4 verse 3, and other places where Jesus talks about your name being blotted out from that book. And so these are Christians, people who have gone through the process to be saved. And that is hearing, believing, and repenting, confessing, and being baptized, and being added to the church. And it says that they were written in the book of life from the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. Another little fascinating phrase right there that shows that this is all part of God's plan. This goes into what we're saying in the book of Revelation, that this is a book of encouragement. This is to tell people, look, this is all part of God's plan. He's known this all along and will continue to know all this. So God's eternal purpose, what we see here, God's eternal purpose is what's in view here, as opposed to the power of Satan, which is feeble compared to God. That's the point. That's the message we need to get from this when we read this. Don't be scared by the beast. Don't be scared by all the stuff that you're reading there, because the point is God is powerful. And so this is to encourage people. So yes, they will overcome. And then he says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. That's a literary device that's used like we would say, you see the old kings saying, hear ye, the trumpeters and the people, the messengers that would go before, or maybe the boy back, you see years ago, standing on the corner with the newspaper, now hear this, or something along, it's basically saying, pay attention, pay attention. And what he says is pay attention, not necessarily what was just said, but what's about to be said. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. To paraphrase this, or to kind of show you what it means, is you need to accept, a Christian must accept whatever comes their way. That's part of counting the cost. If you want to be a Christian, you need to accept the fact that there's going to be difficulties. If you really want to serve God, if you really want to be a disciple of Christ, if you really want that reward that we've been talking about in Revelation now for several chapters, I'll go back to chapter 2. Remain faithful until death, and I'll give you the crown of life. If you want that crown of life, you need to be prepared. Bad things are going to happen. Whether it be the sword, whether it be captivity, whatever it is, you need to submit to God's will. It's going to, and that's the thing we need to understand, that, Satan might win the battle, but he will not win the war. And that's what we're trying to get you to understand. All right. So we look now at the next verse, and the next verse that we have there is going into the other beast that came up out of the earth. Now remember, the first beast came up out of the sea. Let me go back to my picture here so you have a reference. The first beast came up out of the water, and we said that that beast was the beast representing the nations. All right. This beast comes up out of the earth. Now, what happens when you come up out of the earth, out of dirt or whatever? You're going to be filthy. And so what this represents is the basic is religion. It's the anti-God religion. I know that sounds weird. Anti-God religion. Now, when we think of anti-God religion, maybe you think of pagan religions. You might think of religions that have nothing to do with God. There's some that even though they claim to, well, let me just say that. The thing is, it's anti-God religion, anti-Christianity, because there's some religions that even though they claim to believe and know God, they're not doing things the way Christ commanded. They're not doing things with the way that you see in the scriptures. Now, I want you to notice something, who these two beasts are. And let's get this picture and this image in your head real clear. As I mentioned and keep saying, these are the allies of the dragon. So as we're reading through this, you see basically their influence. Okay, their influence is, the way I like to look at it is the sea beast is the hand of Satan. He is those nations, and so he's that physical attack of the church, on the church. Whereas the land beast is the mind of Satan. It is that mental attack. And that's where this comes in and why I say that this is the anti-God religion. So you have nations, you have governments that will attack the church, but then you also have religion that attacks the church. And so one is a physical persecution, the other is a mental persecution. And so that's the picture that you need to see here. So as we continue reading, again, he exercises all authority of the first beast in his presence, causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Now, he is not a slave to the first beast. He's a partner with the first beast. He's helping the first beast, whose main job is to get people to worship and fall down to Satan, to the dragon. And he performs great signs so that he makes fire come down from heaven and earth in the sight of men. You know, again, symbolism. Think about today in false religions of, let's just go back. Go back to Exodus. You remember whenever Aaron and Moses were standing there and they would do the signs, and at first the magicians would come out and they'd do those same signs, and eventually they couldn't do the signs. And then as you progress along, you see Simon the magician. He was doing his signs, and then he became a Christian. Well, think about today, the charlatans that are out there, the faith healers, the snake handlers, and all the different people that do all these things to try to get people to become in that flavor of Christianity, if you will. And then that goes even further into other things that people do to try to convince people. It's false religion. And that's kind of what it's saying here. And that, you know, every year seems like there's a new miracle or something, some special sign that people see. And the pandemic was one of those recently. Everybody thought it was the end of the world, and it's part of Revelation. And so that's kind of what's happening here. It's using false methods to deceive people. That's the whole point, to deceive people. Notice that it says there that he performs these signs and fire, and they deceives those who dwell on the earth. See, there it is, verse 14. By those signs which is granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast. The image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. Now, going back to the description of that beast, notice it says he had two horns like a lamb. So there are several breeds, or some breeds of sheep that have horns. Both sexes have horns on their head. And so the point of this is this comes in the image of the lamb, presenting itself as if it was a pure Yahweh religion. It is Christianity. It is, and it's not. It's presenting itself. Remember, even the Bible tells us that sometimes that even demons present themselves as angels and stuff. So this shouldn't surprise us with this language that what did several of the prophets say and Jesus, that sometimes that false teachers come in like wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. It's kind of the imagery that we have here. It's false religion disguised in this disguise. And whenever you can make all kinds of applications in there. I'll tell you right now, a lot of people want to apply the Catholic Church to this. And I could see where that would come from and why they would say that. However, remember, this was several hundred years before the Catholic Church when this was written. This does represent all anti-God religions, all anti-God governments for all of time. So not just what they're seeing there, but never forget this first century Christians were reading this and they were trying to understand and have hope of what was going on in the world around them. So look at it through their eyes. All right. So it caused many to worship the beast. See, that's what this is all about. Remember what Satan tried to get Jesus to do? He said, I will give you all of this, Jesus, paraphrasing, I'll give you all of this if you'll bow down and worship me. And Jesus responded, it is written, you shall worship only God and serve him. And so see the battle? Still going on right here, trying to get man to bow down and worship. He deceives. And listen, this is what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. That narrow is the way, and few there are that find it. But wide is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many that go in. You see, this is perfect harmony with what Jesus taught, and that people are going to believe the deceit. Do we not see that today even? Think about 2,000 years ago in the Roman Empire. Apparently a lot of people didn't believe the apostles and Christianity, the message that was being sent out, just like many people don't today. And so this has the same application today as it did then. All right, let me make sure I wrap these parts up before we get into the mark of the beast. I know that's one of everybody's favorite things. So another thing that was pointed out here, it's quite interesting, is, God is presented as a Trinity. You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's the Holy Trinity that's presented in the Scriptures. Do you realize that this is an unholy Trinity here? You have Satan, you have the sea beast, and you have the land beast. It's this unholy Trinity. And that's going to play into that number of the beast in just a moment. All right, make sure I'm just up to date on my notes so that we talked about the pagan worship, talked about emperor worship. That's what all this is, trying to get them to kneel down, trying to get them to worship the beast. There's two kinds of people, those that worship God, those that worship the beast. All right, so now we go into verses 16 through 18. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand and on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark of the name of the beast on the number of his name. Now I know when we get into this mark of the beast, that 666, and this is one of people's favorite things to talk about, is that we're worried that we're going to get this literal mark right on our forehead and on our hand. And people start talking about this chip that they want to implant in, and it's Big Brother and all this other stuff. And there's the mark of the beast. Stop. Symbolism. Remember, we've been saying that over and over and over. We've been talking about symbolism this whole time. Jesus Christ is not a literal lamb. Satan is not a literal dragon. All right, remember we started in chapter 12 with this imagery of a woman, a child, a dragon. It's all vision. Continue the vision now with these incredible beasts that represent these certain things, these anti-government and anti-religion. Why all of a sudden would you want to go literal and say we're going to get a physical mark? No. Just as Christians are sealed with the Holy Spirit, Ephesians chapter 1, verse 13, those who believe in God, those who are disciples of Christ, who worship God, are sealed. We even saw that previously in some earlier chapters, chapter 6 and 7. You're sealed with the Holy Spirit. This is just the opposite. Just like you had that unholy trinity with Satan and his allies and the Holy Trinity, you have those who are sealed of God and those who are sealed of Satan. That's what this is. Now there's also commentary that says that, some of these pagan worship, pagan religions and stuff that had tattoos or markings and stuff like that, think about it. It comes to mind for me, for example, I think of Hinduism. A lot of them have that little dot that they put on their head to mark their religion, right? It could be the case that you had to have that mark in order, as it says here, to be able to buy and sell. This is first century talking to them, but it's not a physical thing. It's talking about a spiritual thing. Think about what he says on the forehead and the hand. What's your forehead? That's your brain behind there. That's what you think. It's your thoughts. Satan, the beast, control your thoughts, or you give those thoughts to him. Your hand, what do you do with that? That's action. So your thoughts and your actions are controlled by Satan, by evil, by darkness. Doesn't that harmonize perfectly with the two beasts? One's physical and one's spiritual. One is the actions and one of them is the mental. You see how all this is literary devices, it's apocalyptic literature, it's all harmonizes together. I hope and pray I'm explaining this well so that you can grasp what we're saying here. And then you get in that famous verse. Here's wisdom. Let him who understands calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of the man. The number is 666. And we talked about, now, I'm not going to go into all the detail like I did in the beginning of this series. Go back and watch the introduction, and I answered this question right here in lots of detail. But I'll say real quick that people like to take this number and make it a cryptogram. All right? It is not. It is not some number that you need to figure out. And what people do is they want to identify this, like you see right there with the 666 in the UPC barcode. They'll take these numbers and they'll assign certain numbers and they'll say, oh, that number is Hitler. Just use your common sense. If this is symbolism and that was 1940, all right, that is 1,940 years or so after people received this letter. Why do they care about Hitler? What does his number mean to them in the first century? And some people go, well, therefore it's Nero. That's what this one is right there. And these numbers up here, the Hebrew numbers, and Hebrew is Nero Caesar is Neron Caesar in the Hebrew, and they give numbers. There it is. There's the man. Once again, that's not the point when it's all symbolism. Remember what we said. All these numbers, all these things, everything we see is symbolism. So what does the number mean? Remember I said that unholy trinity of Satan and his two beasts versus a holy trinity? Use those numbers. Whenever you get 7, typically the number 7 is mostly associated with God because he's whole, he's complete, he's perfect. And so that represents perfection and holiness. You take the number 6, it falls short of perfection. And even though 666 is a bigger number than 7, it still falls short of the perfection of 7. So basically what it means is it's failure upon failure upon failure. Now stop and think about the history of the world. Has mankind, in the eyes of God, go back to the Garden of Eden, has mankind been a huge success? No. There's been failure upon failure. You think about the Garden of Eden. You come on through the history and you see the flood. The world was so wicked that God had to destroy it with the flood. Even after that, then you see people building a Tower of Babylon. Even after that, you have people that he makes his own. And even those people, right as he's writing the law, they make a golden calf. You see that nation grow, and then they divide because they want a king like everyone else around them. And then they are so eat up with paganism and with idolatry that God's patience runs out, and he sends them both the north and the south kingdom, into captivity. Still doesn't fully get their attention. Only a remnant comes out of that. He sends his son into the world, and the world kills him. You see what I mean? Failure upon failure upon failure. This is symbolism. And when we read this, we need to understand that's what we're trying to get across, what the vision's trying to get across, what John's trying to help us understand is this is symbolism. And so, considering that, look at what these represent. So as we have said, the woman is that physical and spiritual Israel. The child is Jesus Christ. These are all symbolism. These all represent different things. A dragon, the dragon is Satan. The beast of the sea are those opposing governments, any government that is anti-God. The beast of the earth is going to be, he's called the false prophet. That's another way we know this is religion when we get to chapter 16, verse 13. And so it's the false prophet. It's those opposing religions. And then those that are marked by the beast, those are Satan's disciples. These are worldly people. And so what you wind up having here, and this is going to continue to develop in the next chapter, chapter 14. And in that chapter, you're going to see even more of this. And what we're showing here is an appearance and contrast. That's what John is revealing to us. There is a contrast that's taking place. You have the dragon, or Satan, versus God. Remember, this all started with that war in heaven. Well, what do you have? You have Satan's allies. Who does he have? Who's he called up? He's called up two beasts as his allies. And now he has those that are marked by the beast. What does God have on his side? Well, God has, we've already talked about that going back to chapter 4, right? In Revelation chapter 4 through 7, we know that God's allies is his own son, the Lamb, Jesus Christ. And go back, because this is going to come into play when we get into chapter 14. I'm kind of giving you a little preview here. He already has the 144,000 sealed. See, that's a symbol there of the followers. It's a small number. Going again, Matthew chapter 7, 13 and 14. But there it is. You see Satan's allies and God's allies. It's Satan against God, and both of them have enlisted allies to help them. This isn't all. This is just what we're read up to right now. When we get into the next few chapters, we're going to see this list right here grow even more. And so the question, and that's the lesson that this vision is transmitting, is communicating even to first century Christians all the way up to today. Who do you worship? You have a choice. You either worship the dragon or you worship God. You're either on Satan's side, you're one of his allies, or you're one of God's allies. One or the other. And so there's another key point. I know I'm running out of time here. I've gone a long time, and I appreciate your patience. I hope this has been beneficial for you. But there's one more key point that I love that I want to share with you, and that is this pattern, what you learn. I want you to imagine being a first century Christian and you're receiving this letter. And I broke it down into 7 parts for you. Okay? So the 7 candlesticks. What was the message we saw in that? It was Jesus saying, I know your works. I'm there with you. I know your works. The 7 seals of judgment is basically God telling us, Jesus telling us, I know your persecution. I know what you're going through. I see it. I'm there with you. I haven't left you. The 7 trumpets. We see that Jesus knows our tribulations. And then now, in these 7 symbolic figures, what's being communicated or transmitted is, all right, first he says, I know, I know, I know. Now he's saying you need to know your enemy. You need to know who's against you. That's why you have this vision, so you can see this vision that's in Revelation, so you can see what's happening in reality. Friends and brethren, this is reality. I know it doesn't seem like it because it's in the spiritual world, but whenever we cross over, we're going to see it is indeed reality, and it has been since the dawn of time. So, yep, a lot of crazy different things that we see in this, but I just pray that I've given you enough information that you can start reading this and start to put some pieces together. Now, as I've said before, I didn't give you every single detail that's available, but I gave you as much as I can in the quickest amount I can in an overview. It's now up to you to go back and study, and I hope that you will keep going back and beginning in Revelation chapter 1 and come up to this point, because every time you do that, it's going to get more clear, it's going to be more encouraging, and you can see now why it's one of my favorite books in all the Bible. Friends and brethren, thank you so much for joining me here tonight with this Bible study for Revelation is Real. Wow, we're getting into the thick of it. Next week, we will continue with Revelation chapter 14 and tie all these things we've been talking about together and then continue on from there. I appreciate all your comments, appreciate all your encouragement in this study. I pray that it has helped you grow in your own Bible knowledge, and I pray that if you are watching this and you're not a member of the Lord's church, that you will consider that you will, if you need to know more about it or want to know more about it, you'll get in touch with us and contact us, and we'll sit down and study with you, or come visit us at the Margaret Street Church of Christ. Thank you again. God bless. Have a great rest of your week.